Guys, so I hope you enjoyed the book that we just read. And let's talk about books real quick. So we have some books like that one that had no pictures, right? And then we have other books that have a lot of pictures, right? But then that's not really the type of books. So that's not how we really describe a book or characterize a book, right? So we have different type of books. We have two big type of books. We have fiction books and we have nonfiction books, right? And those are called the genres. So for books, we don't say, oh yeah, what type of book are you reading or what kind of book you're reading? It's what genre, right, are you reading? And so we have fiction and we have nonfiction, which you're probably familiar with. We have fiction books, right? And those fiction books could be divided into so many books, right? So fiction just means a story that is made up. It's not real. And so for fiction, we have so many. We have myths, right? And so this is one of my favorites. So Greek mythology, right? If you notice on the myth, there is a place right in front, right? So a myth, it's actually um, made up stories, right, about a specific group of people. So we have Greek mythology, we have African mythology, I mean, you name it, right? It's any group of people have their own mythology, and really it's just stories explaining how that group of people used to live many, many years ago, right? So usually it involves many gods, and right. We also have just fiction stories like fantasy and fantasy and like fairy tales, which you're probably very familiar with fairy tales, right? Fairy tales is it involves magic. So any story that has magic, princesses and princes and um, talk maybe some talking animals, maybe I don't know. We do have fables, and fables do have talking animals. So fables is pretty much a story about animals, right? They most of the time they do talk, and the important thing is to remember that a fable teaches you a lesson, a life lesson. Then we have folk tales, and folk tales. Remember how we talked about myth right now, and myth it belongs to a group of people. Folk tales also belong to a group of people, right? But the really cool thing about folk tales is that they were passed down verbally. Okay, so that means that the stories were told, talking, not in a book form. Not nobody wrote it down and then they started reading the book. No, it was like maybe one day the mom was telling her daughter a story, and then the daughter had daughters who later on and then told her the story, and then that daughter had kids and then told them the story, and then they told the story, and then they told the story until now we have them in books. But folk tales usually they were told by voice, not by a book. Okay. Then we have one of my favorites, which is science fiction. And science fiction is usually a story about the future, but okay, it involves some sort of technology that doesn't exist or something like that. So, for example, Star Wars, right? Star Wars is all about flying ships and stuff that we don't have. It's all made up, right? But it's something that's supposed to happen in the future. And then we have my second favorite, which is historical fiction, right? And these are stories that are made up based on true people. So when you're reading, so this one's kind of tricky. So historical fiction, and there's another one that's very tricky, which is realistic fiction. Okay, those two, they are they could be true. Okay, so realistic fiction. Let's talk about that one first. So realistic fiction is a story. It's a made up story on that with real people, with real things and real places. Okay, so it's like a story about a little girl who grew up in Houston, Texas, right? All of that is true, but the story is made up, right? And then we have historical fiction, and historical fiction is also a made up story, but using famous people or famous events, famous places, right? So it could be about a little girl who met Martin Luther King, right? We don't know if it's true or not. I mean, probably not, right? It's a made up story about this little girl who ended up meeting Martin Luther King, right? A famous person. So those would be kind of like historical fictions. Or a little boy growing up during the World War, right? World War One or World War Two, or the Civil War, or anything, or something like that. That would be like a historical fiction. Um, and then for nonfiction is a true story. Remember, nonfiction is true stories, true events, true things, right? So some examples of those would be like magazines and maps and dictionaries and journals, diaries, okay, newspapers, news journals or news articles. All of that would be a part of nonfiction, okay? So menus would also be a good nonfiction. All right. There's so much more, right? Anything that's just real information, it would be a nonfiction. Okay. So let's review. We have two types of two big genres in books, right? We have fiction and we have nonfiction. Fiction, it's not real. Nonfiction is real.